The brain has about 86 billion neurons. Neurons are the cells in the nervous system that translate data between different parts of the body. The neuron is made up of a cell body, an axon, and a dendrite. Our brain cells communicate with each other when one brain cell releases a chemical to the next. The process of a signal or data transferring from one neuron to the next is called neural firing. The brain is an energy hog. In a normal adult, the brain makes up about 2% of the person's body mass, but accounts for 20 to 25% of the energy used. A small portion, around 25%, is used for base bodily functions, things like breathing and digestion. The remaining 75% is used in active conscious activity, things like thinking and movement. In order to save energy, our brains form shortcuts called neural pathways. There is an old axiom: neurons that fire together, wire together. This means that the connection between neurons gets stronger with frequent repetition. These neural pathways serve as shortcuts between stimulus and response, allowing us to take action or complete tasks with little conscious thought, thereby conserving energy. They grow strong with use so that complex tasks can become automatic. They will also weaken when not used. Classical conditioning is an example of an automatic response or a neural pathway in action. Most people are familiar with Pavlov's dog. In 1897, Ivan Pavlov published a study. In the experiment, dogs would begin to salivate in the presence of the technician that normally fed them. He also added an external stimulus like a ringing bell or the sound of a metronome just before feeding. After only a few repetitions, the dog would begin to salivate at the sound. Even though we are much more sophisticated in many ways, we behave in a similar way. In the 1930s, B.F. Skinner proposed a theory of operant conditioning or instrumental conditioning. This theory uses reinforcement or punishment to change behavior. It is often referred to as positive reinforcement, but there is also negative reinforcement and punishment and reward. When certain behavior is rewarded, it will happen more often. When punishment occurs, behavior is less likely to occur. Punishment and reward create subconscious automatic responses to outside stimuli and shape our behavior. All of the conditioning we have experienced in our past creates what psychologists refer to as schemas and scripts. In his book, Cognitive Behavioral Therapy Made Simple, Dr. Seth Gillihan explains it like this. Imagine you're walking in a big city looking for a restaurant where you're meeting a friend. When you enter the restaurant, your senses will be bombarded with countless stimuli, people standing, others sitting, various rooms, and so forth. If you had to consciously process each stimulus, it would take an enormous amount of time to figure out the setup. Fortunately, our minds contain maps that help us quickly make sense of the situation, assuming it's not the first time we've been in a restaurant. We know that the person who greets us is the host, so we explain that we're meeting a friend who will be joining us shortly. We are not the least bit surprised when the host hands us a piece of paper after we sit down, and we know that this piece of paper will have a list of food items and drinks and the prices for each. Our entire meal will unfold in a predictable way, through the paying of the check and the saying goodbye to the host on our way out. We navigate through our daily life using learned behavior, stimulus response, and schemas and scripts, all of which allow us to understand and comprehend our world quickly and accurately, based almost entirely on previous experience. Our initial emotional reaction to any event depends almost entirely on our schemas, scripts, and neural pathways that have been built based on our past experiences. Dr. Robert Levinson once defined emotions as short-lived psychological, physiological phenomena that represent efficient modes of adaptation to changing environmental demands. The brain processes emotion in a series of steps. First, the incoming information must be appraised and assigned an emotional value. This process is often very quick and may go beyond our conscious awareness. We can then identify and feel the emotion. Depending on the social situation, we may have to regulate that emotion's expression. For example, there are times when we may want to express rage or disgust, but have to keep calm regardless. Emotion orchestrates a variety of bodily and neurological responses, including sensations in the viscera or gut, expressions in the face and body, and altered attention and thought. These responses are usually very helpful in the immediate ways to help the mind and body coordinate for emergent situations. These emotions can serve as an indicator that a neural pathway, schema, or script has been activated. An emotion is much like a light on the dashboard of your car. The light serves as a warning device to alert you that there is something wrong. The light itself is not the problem, but the light informs you that some situation or malfunction of the vehicle requires attention. The vehicle is in a state that may require some interaction or remedy in order to not do damage to the vehicle or to sustain injury to yourself, or both. Our emotions serve much the same purpose. They are indicators that our mental state is in need of attention. Some threat has been perceived. It may be real or imagined, but our brain, or limbic system, reacts to all perceived threats as real. Chemicals are released and the physiological response occurs. Problematic thoughts are thoughts that create an inappropriate physiological response. We can identify a problematic thought by the emotion it elicits. If we feel a sudden shift toward negative emotions or can't shake a negative feeling, or if we're struggling to act in line with our goals, then problematic thoughts may have been triggered and an emotional response follows. These, of course, are nothing more than thoughts. So our challenge then becomes, how do we bring these thoughts captive? For by stopping the thought, we stop the neural pathway from firing, stopping the chemical process, and stopping the emotion. The first job is to recognize that the light on the dash has come on. Sometimes the light may be green, nothing too serious, just baseline information. However, oftentimes yellow or red lights appear. These are much more serious and almost always require swift action. Understand that I'm not talking about real threats, a close call in traffic, a physical assault or threat of one, confronting a dangerous animal in the wild. All of these are situations where a red light is appropriate and sudden corrective action is needed. I call these 1% reactions. However, much more often, 99% of the time, the threat is not real or not as grave as it seems. A traffic jam, a rude clerk at the store, or a thoughtless comment by a coworker may elicit the same response as a 1% situation, and our red light emotional response is not appropriate. We think the thoughtless coworker is trying to undermine our position. We think that the traffic is personally unfair. Any number of scenarios can play themselves out in our minds, but they are almost always fear of future events or memories of past unpleasantness, and they almost always linked to problematic thoughts triggering automatic responses. If we can have the self-awareness to recognize that these 99% situations are not threatening, and we can then calmly analyze why we are reacting as we are, we will very often find that problematic thoughts are at work. By way of example, in my own life I realized that every time I would drive my car, I would find myself feeling frustrated or even angry at other drivers, and so I began to question why. I realized that there had been several instances where in the past a traffic situation had occurred, and I observed drivers who were behaving in an irresponsible manner, who were taking risks, breaking the law, speeding, driving too close, any number of things that had either created the incident or were adding to the traffic issues. And I began connecting traffic snarls to poor driving, and from that made the unconscious decision that all the other drivers were stupid or crazy, or their inability to drive was causing my delay. I viewed all of the other drivers on the road as an impediment to me getting where I wanted to go, and I felt all of this was very personally unfair, and that caused an anger response in me. As a result, over time, I came to realize that I was getting angry almost every time I drove. I had created a mental shortcut from driving to angry. Almost every time I got behind the wheel, I would become angry. I didn't actually process the thoughts in between. Driving triggered anger. It happened even when traffic wasn't that bad. Pretty much any time I was behind the wheel, I was at least a little bit annoyed. When I realized this was happening, I made a choice to change the script. I accepted a new story that I told myself. When I felt myself become annoyed or frustrated, when I felt the physiological response I identified as anger well up, I would stop the old script from running by stopping the thoughts. Instead of cursing the other drivers on the road either out loud or in my head, I would remind myself that yes, traffic is heavy. This is nothing unusual because it's rush hour. Yes, this has created a delay for me, but accidents happen, and no one's trying to cause a wreck or create a traffic jam. In fact, they're having a much worse commute than I am. Just like me, everyone else is just trying to get to their destination, and I need to have patience. As a result, over time, my new neural link was created, and I found patience while driving to be a more automated process. I replaced an old neural pathway with a new one by changing my thoughts about other drivers. As a result, I found my commute to be much more enjoyable. I didn't arrive at my destination any sooner, but I did arrive in a much better frame of mind. Note that the trigger to change the thoughts was the negative emotion of anger. In this example, more than just thoughts change. As I mentioned before, neural pathways grow stronger with use and weaker with disuse. By changing the thoughts, we create new neural pathways. Old pathways become weaker, and the associated neurons wither and die. With the new thoughts, new pathways are created. New neurons grow, become stronger with frequent repetition. This process is known as neuroplasticity. It means that our brains can change. New cells grow and flourish. Pathways are created. By changing the way we think, we can change the physical structure of our brain.